This interview with Barbara Gould is under the auspices of the Maria Rogers Oral History Program and the University of Colorado Jewish Studies Department. It is one of a number of interviews related to the history of Boulder Action for Soviet Jewry. It is August 25th, 2010. I am Shirley Steele, and Liz McCutcheon is filming. Barbara, you can start us off by telling us where and when you were born and where you grew up.
I was born in New York City, September 1955, in the borough of Queens, and I grew up in Jamaica Estates, New York, and moved out to Colorado in 1979.
So, what was it? What kind of community did you grow up in? I'm trying to find out what kind of experiences you had that may have led you to the BASJ.
I grew up in a mostly Catholic neighborhood, a few Jewish families scattered throughout, but mostly it was a Catholic neighborhood. My father was a refugee from Poland. He came to the United States when he was 11 years old, and he actually would be having his 100th birthday this week, so quite a while ago. And my mother was a child of immigrants as well. New York, of course, is very culturally diversified, so always lots of different languages being spoken in my neighborhood, and a general sense of diversity.
Was it acceptable diversity among the children?
Oh,
and families, I guess.
Well, that's a great question. There were different times in my elementary school time when I recall not nice things being said to me because I was Jewish. But it's funny, I don't ever think back on my childhood and feel that I was in any way victimized by anti-Semitism. Perhaps because my parents had very strong opinions about how to deal with that. My father basically said, this is the way it is. I remember one day when I was ready to go out and fight a kid, like that would have really ever happened. But somehow someone had called me a dirty Jew, I think, and I was decided to come inside before I was going to go out and fight, which of course meant I probably really didn't intend to leave the house. But he said, you don't go out and hit, and you don't go do that. You always know who you are and remember where you came from. And that was something that my parents repeated to me over and over again, that it had to do with inner strength and inner pride, and always having a sense of the strength and fortitude that brought them to this country.
Yeah. It says a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to do the math, but I can't. So did you move to Boulder before or after college?
Right after college.
Okay,
right after college. I went to college in Boston. I went my first 2 years to Emerson College, my last 2 years of college to Wheelock, which is a small teaching school in Boston, taught for a year, and then moved out here.
So your major in college was education?
Was education.
Mm-hmm.
And I taught preschool in Boulder for about 6 months when I first moved here, and then went in a different direction.
What brought you here?
I moved out here with a boyfriend,
Oh, all right.
much to my mother's dismay, and how she put up with the things I did, I don't know.
You said that you went off in a different direction from teaching preschool, and I know you ended up in a different direction. So how did you get there?
I loved working with kids, but found that I was more interested in what was going on for them psychologically than I was educationally. And I wanted to pursue a different avenue of work. I was probably 22, 23 at the time, and I wasn't sure quite what. And my mother was so supportive of me and willing to support me financially for a while. And I asked for about 6 to 8 months to kind of explore, and I volunteered everywhere. I volunteered at the Safe House, the Women's Resource Center, which no longer is around, People's Clinic, the Mental Health Center, and I'm sure I'm leaving some things out. I just wanted to work with people of all ages, in all areas of life, and try and see what really was interesting to me. My volunteer work at the Women's Resource Center and the Safe House turned into a job. It was just as the Safe House was incorporating, becoming its own agency, and opening for the first time. Now it's such a well-established agency in Boulder County, but at the time it was opening a women's shelter and addressing issues of violence against women was very radical. And it was a really exciting time. And that job changed my life in many ways. So I worked at the Safe House for a year or so as a counselor and decided I wanted to become a social worker. Went back to graduate school at DU, got my master's in social work, and then I was a school social worker for about a year until the program director position at the Safe House opened, and I became the program director.
And so you're going into the world of activism.
I'm going into the world of activism, that's right. And many of the people that I met through that job, including my dearest friend, and my husband actually too, are just long-lasting relationships. So Sarah Jane and Bill Cohen were both lawyers on our referral list because they were great advocates for women. Roxanne Balin was the director, I guess she was the director at that time, of the Legal Aid and Defender program at CU. So she and I shared some cases that we worked on together, and that's how we became friends. And part of my job as a counselor was putting together a board of directors. So a lot of these people became board members for the Safe House, so I was able to work with them in ongoing ways. Audrey Fishman Franklin, a lot of names, probably a lot of people that you'll interview for BASJ. We, yes, all kind of lead the activist life.
Were you involved at all in these early years with Soviet Jewry?
I was not, and
with Russia in any way?
Not really. No. You know, my grandfather was from Kiev and escaped here with his family, with his sisters, not with his parents. His parents died, but with his sisters when he was 15. That was really my only association, and I was not connected Jewishly at all. And I'm not sure why. It just was not part of my consciousness. Perhaps in a political way it was, but I was not in any way part of Jewish community.
Holocaust, did that impinge on you in terms of your activism?
No, no. Not, not really. Not really. I was pretty distant from all things Jewish. I identified in a cultural way, whatever that means, or had a, you asked about my upbringing before, conservative Jewish home. I was raised at a conservative synagogue where I was active at the synagogue, but my parents were not. Never have seen my mother in synagogue. And my father only went at high holidays. We did basic holidays. So there really wasn't much that connected me as I grew up.
So how did you, we're up in the 80s now,
Mm-hmm.
the early 80s, and how did you get involved with the BASJ?
Well, Roxanne and I were very close friends through Safe House, as I had said, and Roxanne has a very lovely, quiet way about her volunteerism. So I kind of knew that she was getting involved with Soviet Jewry and was working with Bill Cohen and Murray Richtel and others because she'd occasionally mention it. But as more families started coming, they realized that they needed someone to coordinate things, someone with some social work experience. And by that time, I had left the Safe House. I married, had 2 children. So now we're at the end of the 80s, I think probably around 1989, maybe 1990. And Roxanne asked me if I was interested in the position of Resettlement Coordinator. And it sounded very interesting to me. Had always felt emotionally connected Jewishly, just had not had the experience of being in Jewish community as an adult. So I went one afternoon and met with Roxanne and Bill, and I don't think Murray was there, but we talked about what a job would entail, that it would be volunteer coordination, and as well as, I guess, resource coordination, working with families, making sure that families got connected in ways that they needed to be connected. So by that time, I think BASJ had already welcomed 2 families and planned on bringing many, many more. So I was very fortunate to get in to that work really at the beginning.
Did they give you a specific title for your job? Or
I think Resettlement Coordinator was the title. Yeah, it wasn't a wonderful title, I guess, but it described what it was. So.
And did you have any help?
We had so many volunteers and such positive energy from the community. I've done a lot of work in the Jewish community since Boulder Action for Soviet Jewry, and I know that it is kind of a rare thing to have all parts of the Jewish community join together with equal passion for an issue. But we had people from all the various congregations. There weren't as many then as there are now, but as well as people who were not affiliated, and also people who weren't Jewish, who were just very interested in helping families to resettle and to become comfortable here.
I lost a step in there. When you took the position, they had two families, but then there were a lot of people in the community who were involved and interested and so forth. What came in between?
What came in between? Actually, a lot came in between, because at first, and I'm sure that Bill talked more about this and remembers more of the details. At first, Boulder Action for Soviet Jewry was under the direct auspices of Jewish Family Services in Denver. And JFS in Denver was already resettling many, many Soviet refugees. But Boulder and Denver are very different places. And we had ideas about how we thought people should be welcomed into our community. It's a very different community than Denver in many ways. So, and I don't want to lose track of your question. I'm already going off to a different subject. So, so there was, when we first started talking about what my job would look like, there was a lot of question about who would supervise me, who would I directly report to. I think it was important to Bill and important to me that I be able to be as focused in Boulder as much as I could, and not have to just rely on the supports in Denver. And I'm not suggesting that there was anything negative about the Denver program. It was simply different. Employment needs and resources were different, things like that. So when I was first hired, we did go through quite a process of working with JFS Denver and Federation to create a position here that was very Boulder-based. So what we agreed on was that I would work directly with Bill Cohen as my supervisor and go to JFS monthly for meetings, for staff meetings and things like that. When we realized that we were going to have many families joining us here, we immediately started putting together volunteer groups before they arrived, so that we were prepared. We set up a system of host families, which so many people were eager to do. So host families didn't actually house new Americans, but they were their support system. They were the people who would make sure that needs were being met, provide some social attention, things like that. So we were doing trainings for host families. We had a medical committee put together because we knew that people would be coming with major medical issues, which actually I don't think we even anticipated just how challenging that was going to be. We had an employment committee because we knew that people would be coming with various skills that may or may not translate to what was happening here. So all these different groups and task forces of people who were just so excited to be helpful. and an incredible talent. I mean, just incredible professional talent from all over the community. There were there are some details, because we're going back so far now, that I don't quite remember, but refugees who came through HIAS didn't come with the same, they weren't eligible for social services in the same way that, let's say, a refugee from a different country now would be. They were...
Why would that be?
Because, I'm not sure. And that might be a question that Bill could answer. We needed to provide for people within our community in a very big way. So we had private doctors who agreed to see our folks at little or no charge. Bill Shivitz was a doctor at the time who just was, he even learned Russian to be able to communicate well with his patients. We just had amazing volunteerism. We had dentist Bob Baxt, was a dentist who would see people at, for little or no charge to be able, and oh my goodness, they came with serious, serious dental needs. So all of these teams of people just rose to the occasion in the loveliest way.
If I came to you, if it were back then, and I came to you and said, I really want to be a host family, what would you tell me to do?
Well, I would say thank you, and that's wonderful. And I would ask you what draws you to that kind of volunteer work. Part of what was challenging is that some host families felt, many people have a similar life story to me, that they have a grandparent or a parent who came from another country, and possibly Russia. And so people thought, well, I want to be a host family because I love my grandfather, and I want to have a relationship with someone just like my grandfather. And that, while admirable and lovely, was not always that helpful, because the folks that we brought over were not from our grandparents and our parents' generation. It's a different generation, and they had been through and lived in a very different culture. Also, for many of us, our families came from the northern part of the former Soviet Union, and most of our families come from the southern part, from Tajikistan and elsewhere. So very different cultures. So we would have had to have discussed that it would probably not be the experience of meeting your grandparents or parents again, that these are folks with entirely different needs. And I would ask you what kind of time commitment you were willing to make, because certainly up front, when a new family came, it's an enormous time commitment. As the resettlement coordinator, I would make sure that there was an apartment that was rented, that there was furniture in the apartment, that there was food in the apartment.
Did you go out to rent the apartment?
I did.
You did? Okay.
Yeah, I did. And that the billing would be taken care of. So in other words, that the landlord would understand who they were housing and how all of that was going to work. But the host family was the family that would come in and create the warmth and the friendship, and come over to our house for dinner, who would do the come on, let's go to the grocery store, which was huge. I mean, people at first, our volunteers were so excited. Oh boy, I can't wait to take them to the grocery store because they'll be so excited to see everything that we have here. Well, going to the grocery store is terrifying. To have 25, 30 choices for what kind of bread to buy, and to not be able to read the label or understand the pricing or any of those things. So I would also, if you were a host family, kind of guide you through what it's like to take somebody through a new experience like that, because the amount of choice and the abundance that we take for granted was really quite overwhelming for people. So host families might also be the ones who would do the doctor visits. Sometimes at the very beginning I would take people to the doctor just to kind of get them settled and understand what was going on medically for them. But those kinds of transportation things, going to the Social Security office, dealing with the forms and the papers and all of those things, really was the host family. And I know that those families maintain and still have very close relationships with the families that they worked with.
How did the families who came in, how did you handle the finances? You rented the apartment, but somebody had to pay the rent.
You know, I can't quite remember how that worked. My guess is we put some money down. When families came through HIAS, they had support for, I think 4 or 5 months. It might have been a little bit longer. So there was that guarantee of rent and finances for that amount of time. But, and I could be off a few months with that, but people were expected to get jobs very quickly and start being able to pay.
Which
and
brings us to employment.
Mm-hmm. So we had some big employers here who were willing to take lots of people when they came. Neodata was one. Neodata is not around anymore, but placed a lot of people at Neodata, placed a couple of people at Amgen, at some of the larger corporations. There was another company in town that was one of these high-tech computer things, and I can't remember the name now, but they also employed many of our folks, and it allowed them to get settled, get on their feet, and then move forward. And some, actually one person I can think of is still, actually she's about to retire from the company that she started at when she first got here, and she's been very, very successful. And just steadily moved up the ladder so that she's in a leadership research position at this point.
Did the new Americans who were coming in have comparable skills? Or
Yes and no. Some had to go to school. There were several who came who were doctors and who were not able to work as doctors here, but could work in medical research, or a couple did go back to school and they were able to get degrees. But not really. And you know, it's very, very difficult to have lived in a place and enjoyed a certain amount of professional prestige and come here and not be able to speak a language and not be recognized for who you are, but actually talked down to or treated as someone without much regard. So I think it was difficult. I think for many of the men who came, it was particularly difficult, and learning the language for them was quite challenging. Women, for whatever reasons, I know that there are lots of different theories or studies about this. Women were able to learn the language a lot faster and become more able to step forward into the workplace. So.
Going back to your job,
Mm-hmm.
I suppose my guess is there was no such thing as a typical day, but a almost typical day. Could you take us through what would happen?
Sure. Well, of course, the best days were when I could go and meet a family at the airport. And there were many families who came those first couple of years that I was working for BASJ. I think the time I was there, we probably resettled over 100 people. It was a lot. So there were times when it felt like a typical day was going to the airport. And I'd, take host families and volunteers, and it would be a big, exciting, wonderful greeting. But a typical day might be that I would do home visits to a variety of different families, and perhaps we would go to the doctor or to social services, or particularly for seniors who were eligible for Medicaid. So just getting those day-to-day things done. Sometimes I would do some employment kinds of counseling, although I had a lot of volunteer help with this as well. How do you present yourself in an interview? What do you wear? What do you say? And just general visiting with people to see how they were doing and try and assess if there were any needs that we weren't meeting, and if so, how do we do that?
Sounds to me as if it was more individual rather than we're setting up a program that people go
Yes,
through groups.
that's right. That's right. It was very individual. There might have been programs occasionally that we set up more towards the end of my job there, when we had large groups of people. Maybe we'd set up a training about looking for jobs or whatever, but typically not. Typically it was family to family. So in that way it was a great job. I got to know people very well, and I had little kids, and so I was balancing and taking care of my mother at the same time. So I was balancing doing all of that with working, so I could make my own hours, which was wonderful, and I could also bring my children if I needed to, and at times I did. And that allowed them to see what it's like to have such inner strength. The families that we brought over are some of the strongest people I've ever met in my life. For my kids to be able to be a part of seeing what it's like to have to make great change, to take such risk, and always move forward. And move forward, I can't say people always moved forward with a smile on their face, but they attempted to. And it was a great time for my entire family to be able to know these folks, and also to work with Bill Cohen. I mean, every day, I spoke to Bill several times a day, every day. That would be a typical day. I was on the phone with Bill a lot, catching him up on things.
What types of things in general?
Well, he always wanted to know how each family was doing, and then we would talk about who was coming and preparing for new families who were coming. BASJ took families. There were kind of two categories. There was people who were coming because they already had relatives here. So once a family came, they could apply to bring relatives, sisters, brothers, mothers, fathers, children. But there were also cases called free cases, and I'm not sure why they were called free cases, because nothing was free. But those were cases of people who needed to get out because they were in dangerous situations, but they didn't already have family here. And they weren't necessarily families that would be considered easy to resettle. We took families that nobody else would risk. Bill is a remarkable man. I saw him save lives. I'm getting teary here. That man saved lives every single day. It was incredible to be a part of it. He was such a fierce advocate. He was, my parents was always important to them. Social action was certainly a part of how they expressed their Jewishness. And I saw that day to day, mostly through discussion, things that they said, not necessarily things that they did. Not that they weren't doing them, but I don't think I was paying that much attention to them. I was paying more attention to me growing up. Bill and Roxanne, the first people that I had ever been close with who lived their Jewishness through their daily commitment to mitzvot. And they didn't do it with ego. They did it because, it seemed to me they did it because it's simply what you do. And it's simply what you do. I could not, Bill never preached about it in any way, he just did it. And every day he was saving lives. It was absolutely remarkable. There was no turning back for me from seeing that and understanding that that's the way that's the way I wanted to live as well. So I would talk to him every day about who was coming and about what the families here were doing. And it wasn't always smooth, and families weren't always happy. It's very difficult to come to this country and adapt as quickly as we ask people to do. And Boulder, no less, where you don't see many people struggling financially here, and the resources are different than in a big city. So people struggled. People worked very, very hard. Ona's Draperies, that was another company that hired many people.
When you ran into a family which was having a hard time adjusting, what could you do? I'm not asking so much as what did you do, but what could you do?
Well, one thing you could do, and that we did as a community, was shoulder people up during their toughest times, to let them know that we were with them, that they weren't alone, that we would help them, that we would get them through. We would sometimes just listening, just letting somebody talk was helpful. Sometimes people just need to vent, But if someone was having trouble learning English, then if they needed a tutor, I would get them a tutor. If they were having trouble getting a job, then perhaps I would go to job interviews with them or send somebody. In some of these high-tech jobs, it was silly for me to go with them. But send someone along who could kind of talk the talk and do the advocacy. So there was that. When parents were worried about their children, helping out with the school or providing some sort of support system that allowed for better communication with the school, things like that.
They'd almost be required to have a telephone in their apartment so they could call you.
Oh yes, everybody had a phone, and we made sure of that, and televisions, and now I'm sure if we were doing it, everybody would have a computer. It just had to be that they would have as much as we could provide that would allow for easy access to resources. And it's a delicate balance between how much you do for somebody and how much you provide a shoulder or support so that they learn to do it themselves. And that was always a challenge. It's a challenge for me as a parent. It's just a challenge. But I think BASJ really served as a wonderful model for other agencies as to how to provide a community.
How did you, with the volunteers that you got from Boulder, who might have wanted to do everything for the families, how would you handle that?
We did a lot of training. And
again, this is
individual, and I think we did some group training, but I was always in touch with host families as well, because the key to being a volunteer coordinator is to make sure your volunteers feel good about what they're doing. And there were families at times who I wished had been able to step back a little bit and allow for more independence for the families they were connected with. So you work on that as much as you can. And I wasn't always so successful with it, but mostly everyone's turned out okay, so I guess it worked out well. So.
Was there anybody else helping at your level at BASJ?
No, it was just me. And then when I left, Carol Watkins came on and had, I believe, the same title. But there was only one of us at a time. And I guess you would describe us as being kind of middle management. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I suspect you had some things to say about goals, too.
For volunteers or with families, yes, absolutely. Because people had to be self-sufficient by a certain amount of time. And we were very clear with families about that. And for the most part, people met their goals. I think many families came, as many people do to this country, with a sense of streets being paved with gold and that there would be a fortune for everyone, and that is not the case. And some people needed to reset their own goals. But primarily for families, they wanted their children to be safe. And those goals were met. And once they could see that their children were succeeding, there was a greater sense of calm, I think, about it. But yes, we set goals, employment goals, financial goals, and goals around, independence in general. That I believe that we followed families very directly for a year, might have been 2 years, which is different than most resettlement agencies who do that maybe for a few months. But our intent was to stay very connected in an ongoing way with each family for quite some time.
Did families leave Boulder?
Yes. Some left Boulder, not immediately, but they left Boulder in the way that many people leave Boulder, in that it's not a particularly affordable place to live. And there are other areas. Denver is more affordable in many ways. There's a large Russian community there, Soviet community, so and rabbis there. So several moved, but I know you're hearing my bird in the background. But also many have stayed.
So there's kind of a collection now of we were there and we did it.
Right, that's right. That's exactly right.
I'll take a brief break.
Okay.
What strategies did you find successful in working with families and with the goal of having them become independent?
Mm-hmm. Well, there were several things that I think we did. One was to make sure that families were very well connected in the community, that they knew a lot of people, that they did not feel isolated. I think that we did this very well for the most part. For some people, especially when people who were very elderly came, it was difficult to not be isolated because it was hard for them to get around. I know a little bit more about those things now, and I think might have done things a little bit differently. But for the most part, making sure that people were connected in all various parts of the Boulder community, and not just the Jewish community. We worked hard with families to help them learn to navigate systems. So that after BASJ was no longer formally connected with a family, that they would know how to get through the Social Security office, or fill out forms, or work with insurance, understand credit cards and bills, understand how to balance a checkbook and deal with a bank account and banks. All of these various things, hospitals, medical care, these are very big systems that are difficult to navigate even if you've been in this country for your whole life. They're just difficult systems, and so one of our goals was to assure that people understood how to navigate through things, and that if they couldn't, that they knew who to ask for help. And I see many of the families that we resettled still, however many years later this is. Our children are all grown, and they're at various jobs and different stages of their lives. But when something comes up and there's trouble dealing with something, they still know how to ask for help. Now it's more of asking a friend for help. If I have a friend who's good with understanding the legal system, of course I'm going to go to that friend if I have questions. That's what friends do. And so I think that we did a very good job with families around that kind of thing.
I was kind of wondering if you ever had any large groups of the new Americans come together and celebrate various things.
You know, I think that they're, well, now how do I say this tactfully? Just because people came together from a particular country or area doesn't mean they all liked each other. And actually there was a lot of competition between families. That was a cultural phenomenon of working with some of the Russian families that that they didn't always trust each other. So I think what grew out of BASJ is groups of friends, groups of families that have remained close, and families that aren't close. So for a while we were doing little reunion things and holidays. Sometimes we've done Russian Seders, things like that. But now I think that families kind of do that themselves. Those families that get along together have parties over here. The ones that get along with the other group have parties over here. So whenever asked, if we ever say, would you come and join us for such and such, of course everybody does. But I don't know if they do it because they are so excited to do it, or because they are very gracious people. So
you learned a lot about the Russian people who came over. What did you learn about the culture?
Well, I learned, first of all, growing up in communism is very, very difficult. And that a person grows up having to work the system in not always positive ways, just to be able to live. To imagine what it must have been like to wait on bread lines for 10, 12, 15 hours a day, and then have to show your papers, and when they see you're Jewish, somehow you're back at the end of the line. Then sometimes means that you have to find a different way to get to the front of the line. So the things that worked there are not necessarily things that work here. And that was a very hard lesson for people to learn. And it was hard for me to understand as well, that what we needed to get across to people is that what really matters here is that once you get a job is not how you try and manipulate your way through the system, but that you show a good product. Whatever your work is, it has to be good. And you have to show that you want to do it well. And that's what moves you forward. Not how do you find a way to get around the system. It's perfectly reasonable for people to not understand that when they first got here. Family and friends in that culture, the friendships that the Russian families had, or the new American families, however, we were such deep friendships. It was a different kind of loyalty, love, and devotion than we see here.
Do you think that was a part of the immigration assimilation process, or do you think it was there?
I think it was there. I think it was there before, and we've talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
there might not be as many friends, but the level of friendship, of what it means to be a friend, seems to go deeper. I don't even quite know how to describe it, except that it was friends and family were kind of the same. So just a fierce loyalty, I guess. And of course, I think our friendships here are loyal and loving, but a different level of depth. I've noticed for many of the older families, I've seen several people lately through my work at Har Hashem. Part of my job is, when I worked at Har Hashem, was around grief and mourning and issues regarding death. And so I was in charge of selling plots at the cemetery. So for some of the older Russian families, they are doing their pre-planning the way any of us are or should be. And so I've seen several in the past year or so. More of a sense of expectation that their children that it is their children's job to take care of them. And their children believe that too. I don't see that as much from my American friends, Jewish or otherwise. So I think that's interesting. I happen to agree with them. I felt an obligation as a child to care for my parents, and I expect that my children will feel that way as well. But it's more of an ingrained, and with the realization that many of these folks came here as a way of giving their children life, and they did. And their kids are in college or out working, are doctors or lawyers, and are very, very successful. So it's a real sense of sort of living your love for your family, I guess.
With the children, do you have a sense that they have been more successful than as a group than a similar group in this here?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, we don't know that they'd be alive.
True.
we don't know that they would be alive, and not only are they alive, they are thriving. I'm sure that they face challenges that they will have to deal with now and always, but they're doing very well, and that was the plan.
That was a very good plan.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for this interview, Barbara. You added a lot of information, and so it's going to be very helpful.
Good. Thank you, Shirley.